The Arizona sun bore down on Dust Creek with a kind of merciless authority, flattening every shadow and baking the earth until it cracked like old pottery. Heat shimmered above the main road, turning wagon wheels into wavering mirages and horses into ghosts drifting through the haze. Dust rose with each movement, boot, hoof, or wheel, and hung in the air like the dry breath of the desert itself. At the heart of the weary town sagged the Broken Wheel Saloon, its warped boards leaning inward as if the building had grown tired of standing. Yet inside, voices rose, laughter fought against despair, and whiskey blinded a man just long enough to forget his struggles. Caleb McGrath rode into Dust Creek that afternoon on a horse nearly as scarred as he was. The animal's ribs showed faintly beneath its hide, and its gait told a story of miles too long and battles too hard. Caleb himself wasn't much different, big as a mountain, broad-shouldered, dust-caked, with a beard grown in uneven from weeks on the trail. His gray eyes held the weight of storms and battlefields long buried, and the grief that carved its home inside him made him look older than his 37 years. He dismounted with slow, deliberate movements, tying the reins to a hitching post outside the saloon. The wood creaked under his hand, and the wind carried the faintest scent of rain, the kind of storm that hovered but never came. Inside, the saloon air wrapped around him like an old blanket. Smoke, sweat, stale beer, and the faint tang of spilled whiskey. Sawdust crunched beneath his boots. Men hunched over card tables or leaned at the bar, trying to drink away mistakes older than the town. Caleb took a seat at the counter, nodding once at the bartender. "Whiskey," he said, voice rough from dust and silence. The bartender poured without question. Caleb lifted the glass, but before he could drink, a sharp voice cut across the room. "Girl, you bring me another watered-down drink, and I'll give you a lesson you won't forget." The sound snapped the bar into silence, as if someone had pinched the air shit. Caleb turned, eyes narrowing. A heavy man in a fine vest, Hannigan, one of the cattle barons, had seized a young woman's wrist. She wore a faded blue dress that hugged her soft curves, and her copper-colored headscarf framed a face both striking and tired. She was a black woman with a presence that refused to shrink, though fear trembled faintly behind her eyes. Her name, Caleb would later learn, was Clara Dawson. "That whiskey is the same as always," she said, steady though her jaw tightened. "Maybe you've had enough, Mr. Hannigan." His response was a vicious crack of his hand across her cheek. The blow echoed off the walls. Clara stumbled, caught herself against a table, and rose with her head high despite the red mark blooming on her skin. Her strength was quiet but undeniable, unyielding, like the desert itself. Caleb's gut twisted. Something long dormant inside him stirred, the part of him that had once stood for men weaker than himself, for women who deserved better than cruelty. He stood. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simply a big man rising, one whose presence filled the room the way a storm fills the sky. "That ain't no way to treat a lady," he said. The room held its breath. Hannigan glared. "This ain't your business, drifter!" Caleb set down his untouched whiskey, his movements slow and deliberate, as though each gesture carried a warning. "Funny thing about business. Becomes mine when a man lays hands on a woman." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hannigan's hand drafted toward his gun. Caleb didn't move. He didn't even blink. He simply kept walking, unhurried, certain, like he had already made peace with whatever happened next. When Hannigan's fingers touched his holster, Caleb's hand shot out, catching the man's wrist in a grip of iron. With his other hand, he shoved Hannigan through the saloon doors. The man tumbled into the dust, cursing, red-faced, scrambling to his feet. "You'll regret this! You've just made the biggest mistake of your life!" Caleb didn't respond. He simply turned back toward the saloon interior. Every eye was on him. Clara stared too, one hand hovering near her cheek, her breath uneven, yet her chin lifted.
Strength radiated from her, even as her hands trembled. Caleb approached gently, stopping a respectful distance away. His voice softened in a way he barely recognized. "You all right, ma'am?" She drew in a slow breath, steadying herself. "I had it handled." Still, no one ought to handle that alone. For a moment, something passed between them. An understanding neither named, a flicker of recognition that felt impossibly familiar. Behind the bar, an older man rushed forward, gray hair, broad shoulders, jaw set like granite. "Clara, what's going on?" he demanded. Clara straightened. "Nothing, Pa, just Hannigan being himself." Her father turned his hard gaze on Caleb. "And who might you be?" "Caleb McGrath," he said simply. "Just passing through." "Well, Mr. McGrath," Dawson muttered, "you've earned yourself an enemy. Hannigan owns half the cattle in the valley. He don't forgive, and he don't forget." "Neither do I," Caleb replied. "Not as a threat, just truth." Clara's eyes lingered on him longer than before, warm, curious, assessing. A spark lit between them, too subtle for the onlookers, but hot enough to change the air between them. Caleb felt it, Clara felt it, and Dust Creek would never be the same.
Dust Creek woke slowly each morning, like an old man stiff in the joints, groaning its way into daylight. The sun hadn't yet burned off the coolness when Caleb McGrath rode out for his first job as a stage guard. The gold run paid well, and the rough terrain suited a man who preferred silence over conversation. Riding shotgun gave him something to do, something that kept him from pacing the length of the boarding house porch thinking about a woman he had no right to think about. Clara Dawson. Her name had rooted itself in the corners of his mind, unwelcome and unshakable, like a song carried by the wind that refused to die. When Caleb returned from the run 3 days later, he felt the difference before he even reached the broken wheel. People moved differently, glancing over their shoulders, lowering their voices when he passed. Not fear of him, fear near him. Word traveled fast in small towns, but Dust Creek had a way of keeping silent about things it didn't want outsiders to understand. He stepped into the saloon that evening, the familiar smell of smoke and whiskey settling around him like a worn coat, and his eyes immediately sought Clara. There she was, moving through crowded tables with a grace that didn't belong in a place like this, her blue dress hugging her soft figure, her headscarf wrapped neatly today, catching the lantern light with its copper threads. She smiled at customers with courtesy rather than warmth, and Caleb noticed how her shoulders tensed when unfamiliar hands brushed too close. She saw him before he called for her, and something lit briefly in her eyes. Relief? Recognition? Hope? It vanished too quickly to name. Caleb opened his mouth to greet her, but another voice cut through the din. "Miss Dawson." Lucas Graves. Every man in the saloon straightened subtly when the rancher entered, as if the air itself stiffened. Graves dressed as though the dust couldn't touch him, a dark coat tailored to his broad frame, polished boots, a hat too fine for a working man. His pale eyes swept the room, stopping on Clara the way a hawk locks onto prey. He intercepted her path, catching her wrist with practiced entitlement. "We need to discuss our future," he said smoothly. Clara's face didn't break, but her breath did. Caleb saw her inhale sharply. "I'm working, Mr. Graves, if you'll excuse me." Graves didn't release her. He leaned in close, whispering something that made the blood drain from her cheeks. Her father noticed, but didn't step forward. No one did. Except Caleb. He stood so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. The noise turned a few heads, but Graves didn't look. He was still watching Clara like she was a debt he intended to collect. Clara glanced at Caleb, barely a flicker of her eyes, and gave the faintest shake of her head. Not now. Not this fight. Not like this. So Caleb stayed where he was, fists curling at his sides, jaw working like a man swallowing nails.
Finally, Graves released her with a smirk. "Another time," he murmured. "Your father's debts won't take care of themselves forever." Clara pulled away, her composure steady, but the tremble in her fingers betrayed her. Graves left the saloon with the heavy thought of a man who never feared consequences. Caleb sat slowly, heart pounding, fury building in the space behind his ribs, the kind of fury that men reached for guns without thinking. Hours later, long after Graves had gone and the crowd had thinned, Caleb found Clara wiping down tables. Each motion was controlled, careful, as though she were trying to scrub away the memory of the rancher's touch. He approached, boots soft against the floor. "Is he giving you trouble?" Caleb asked. She snorted, quiet, humorless. "Lucas Graves doesn't give trouble, Mr. McGrath. He is trouble." "Caleb," he corrected. She paused her wiping, eyes rising to meet his. "Caleb," she echoed softly, as though testing the name. He watched her face, the tiredness beneath the strength, the bravery covering the fear, the beauty she didn't seem to be aware she carried. Her curves were soft, full, womanly in a way that her presence felt grounding. Her skin, smooth and dark, glowed beneath the lamplight. She carried herself with a dignity that no man had the right to strip away. "You deserve better than men like him," he said. She gave him a long, searching look. "You see more than most men," she murmured. "Most only see a saloon girl. You see past that." Caleb swallowed. "Maybe because there's more to see." The moment stretched, quiet, warm, fragile, the kind of moment that could tip a world off its axis. But then Clara's gaze flicked toward the back room where her father was counting coins. Her entire posture tightened. "This town runs on debts and the men who hold them." "And your father owes Graves," Caleb guessed. Her silence was confirmation. Caleb drew a slow breath, fighting the urge to step closer, to promise her safety he wasn't sure he could deliver. He said instead, voice low, "You ever need help, you come find me." Her eyes softened, though her body still held tension like wire pulled too tight. "I can't ask you for that," she whispered. "You didn't. Offer still stands." She looked at him a moment longer, long enough to imprint something deep in him, then turned away to finish her work. As Caleb walked back to his room that night, the desert wind carried the faint jingle of saloon bells behind him, but Clara's voice followed him farther, echoing, lingering. "You see more than most men." And for the first time in years, Caleb wished he could forget how to see at all.
The storm came without warning. Arizona storms rarely asked permission. They simply arrived, tearing the sky open like a wound. Winds slapped against the buildings of Dust Creek, rattling shutters and sending loose boards creaking in protest. Thunder rolled across the valley, deep enough to make the saloon windows tremble. Clara Dawson lay in her narrow bed above the broken wheel, staring at the ceiling as lightning splintered the darkness. Sleep would not come. Her thoughts ran wild, a herd of frightened horses pounding through her ribs. Lucas Graves' threats replayed in her mind, the coldness in his eyes, the entitlement in his touch, the promises of what he intended for her. Even worse was the knowledge that he had the power to make every threat real. Her father's debts were shackles around both their necks. Clara pressed the back of her hand to her forehead. Sweat had gathered along her hairline despite the storm's chill. Her breath trembled. She needed air. She needed space. She didn't know. Her bare feet hit the floor. She wrapped herself in her thin shawl, tied her scarf tighter, and slipped out the saloon side door. The rain battered the roof as she descended the back stairs and slipped out the saloon side door. The storm soaked her within seconds, but the rain felt honest, cleansing, as though it washed away the dust and the fear and the weight of expectations. Clara walked through the downpour without hesitation, letting the water chill her skin and ease her racing thoughts.
Her steps led her without guidance, without conscious decision. She found herself standing outside Caleb McGrath's boarding room. The lantern in his window glowed faintly behind the curtain. He was awake, restless perhaps, the same way she was. Something in her chest tightened painfully. She shouldn't be here. A decent woman didn't walk alone through a storm into a man's private quarters. A cautious woman didn't approach a man who stirred something dangerous and tender in equal measure. A woman with no freedom had no business seeking comfort she wasn't allowed to want. And yet, Clara lifted her hand and knocked. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Only the drum of rain. Then footsteps. The door opened. Caleb stood there barefoot, shirt loose around his shoulders, hair mussed from sleep. His gray eyes widened at the sight of her, soaked, trembling, wrapped in a drenched shawl that clung to every curve of her plus-size frame. "Clara?" he breathed. She shivered, not from cold. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered. He stepped aside without hesitation. "You're always welcome here." She entered. The warmth of the small room settled over her like a blanket. Caleb closed the door gently, shutting out the storm's howl. Lantern light flickered across his features, strong jaw, scarred cheek, tired eyes that softened whenever they rested on her. He offered her a towel, but her hands were shaking too badly to hold it. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. Clara swallowed hard. She felt the swell of everything inside her, fear, longing, exhaustion, hope, straining against ribs that were too small to contain it. "I'm scared," she said. The admission cracked her voice. "Of staying, of leaving, of everything." Caleb stepped closer, slow and deliberate, giving her room to stop him if she wished. She didn't. "What are you scared of most?" he asked quietly. Her breath shuddered. "Feeling what I'm feeling." His chest rose, fell, as though her words struck him like a physical touch. "What are you feeling, Clara?" For the first time in years, she didn't answer with caution or pretense. She answered with truth. Clara reached for him and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft and trembling at first, hers born from fear, his from surprise. But then Caleb cupped her face with a gentleness that nearly broke her, and she felt him lean into her, steadying her, grounding her. Her hands fisted in his shirt, his breath deepened against her lips. He pulled back only enough to whisper, voice rough, "Are you sure?" Lightning cracked the window. "Yes, God, yes." Caleb touched her cheek as though she were something sacred. He loosened her soaked shawl, draping it aside, careful with every movement. "God, you're big," she whispered before she could stop herself. He froze, not in offense, but in reverence, as though the words were a prayer offered to him. His gaze softened with something she hadn't seen directed at her in years. Admiration, gratitude, awe. "You're beautiful, every part of you," he murmured. Her breath hitched. He drew her close. His warmth enveloped her, his hands broad and steady on her back. Even standing near him, she felt sheltered, protected in a way she had never known. The storm roared outside, but inside Caleb's room the world felt quiet, calm, safe. He kissed her again, slow, deliberate, tender, like a man afraid to break something precious. His touch was careful, reverent, each movement carrying a promise he didn't yet speak out loud. Clara felt tension drain from her limbs as she melted into him. For the first time in her life, intimacy was not fear, not expectation, not something taken. It was something chosen. Hours later, when the lantern burned low and the thunder rolled into the distance, Clara lay in Caleb's arms. His hand rested lightly on her waist, his breath warm against the crown of her head. She felt the deep rise and fall of his chest, a steady rhythm that eased the trembling in her soul. "Clara," he murmured, half asleep, "you deserve a life where no man owns you." She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of his words fill her. "And if you want that life with me, I'll take you anywhere you want to go." Her heart cracked open. But morning, cold, unforgiving morning, waited on the other side of dawn.
Morning did not arrive gently in Dust Creek. It came like a blade, sharp, cold, unforgiving. Clara Dawson felt it long before the sun crept over the hills. She woke in her own bed, though she couldn't recall walking back from Caleb's room. At some point during the night, she had slipped for his arms, wrapped her shawl around herself, and hurried through the rain-soaked alleys while her heart begged her not to leave him. But she had to. She had responsibilities, a father who depended on her, a town that watched her every move, a man, Lucas Graves, who believed she belonged to him long before she ever agreed. She lay now staring at the cracked ceiling, the remnants of the storm still echoing inside her. Her lips were tender from Caleb's kisses, her body warm with the memory of his arms around her, her soul shifted somehow, as though something broken had begun, tentatively, to heal. But hope was a dangerous thing in Dust Creek. By the time Clara dressed and stepped into the saloon's main room, the quiet was wrong, too still, too heavy. Her father stood behind the bar, polishing the same glass over and over, not meeting her eyes. The morning light filtering through the windows felt weak, as though even the sun didn't want to touch whatever waited for her. "Pa?" Clara said softly. Tom Dawson swallowed hard. His shoulders were hunched, a posture she had never seen on him except after bad news and worse mistakes. "Clara," he said, voice thick, "Lucas Graves is waiting in the back room." Her blood turned to ice. She felt it, the trap snapping shut, the chains tightening. For a moment she considered running, just turning and bolting through the side door, sprinting all the way to the edge of town, all the way to Caleb. He would protect her. He had promised as much with his hands and with his voice and with his steady, quiet devotion. But she knew better. Graves would follow. Graves would burn the world to claim what he believed was his. And Caleb, Caleb, would throw himself in front of that fire without hesitation. Her legs trembling, Clara walked toward the back room. She pushed the door open. Lucas Graves sat at a round table with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, the picture of a man comfortable in his victory. Papers were spread across the table, mortgage slips, debt notes, legal documents stamped by judges already in his pocket. "Well," he said smoothly, "there she is." Clara's fingers clenched around her skirt. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted. You." His pale eyes swept over her as if she were property being appraised. "Your father's debts have come due, all of them, today." "That's impossible," she whispered. "He can't owe—" "Oh, but he does." He pushed the papers forward. "The interest, the fines, the fees. I warned you my patience had limits." Clara scanned the pages, her heart hammered harder with each one. There was no way out, no negotiation, no mercy. Graves leaned back in his chair. "There's only one payment I'll accept." Clara didn't need to ask. Her stomach turned. "You," he said simply. Her throat tightened so hard she could barely breathe. "You can't do this?" "I can, and I will." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. He tossed it on the cable. It slid across the polished wood and spilled open. Gold coins. "I'll tell the sheriff these were found in Caleb McGrath's saddlebag. Convenient, isn't it? A drifter stealing from my shipments. Theft of this amount carries a hanging sentence." The room tilted around her. "If you refuse me," Graves continued, "Caleb dies before dawn. Your father rots in prison, and you—" He paused, letting the silence smother her. "A woman as pretty as you will fetch a high price in a Tucson brothel." Clara bit her lip until she tasted blood. "Choose," Graves said.
Her breath came in a broken, trembling exhale. Her mind screamed, begged her to run, to fight, to do anything but surrender. But she saw Caleb's face, his gentle hands, his steady voice, the way he had looked at her as if she were something worth saving. She couldn't let him die. She couldn't let her father fall. So Clara forced the words out, each one cutting her like a blade. "Fine," she whispered. "I'll do it." Graves smiled, triumphant. "The preacher arrives at sunset. Wear your mother's dress." Clara's knees nearly buckled. She clung to the edge of the table to stay standing. "And Clara," Graves added, rising to his full height, "after tonight, you will not speak to that drifter again." When she stepped back into the saloon, her father looked at her with shame, hollowing out his eyes. "Clara," he whispered, "not now." She climbed to the stairs to her room and shut the door before her legs gave out beneath her. She pressed her hand to her mouth to choke back a sob. A wedding, a prison, a life she did not choose. She fell to her knees beside her bed, trembling violently. "Caleb," she whispered into the quilt, "I'm so sorry." She wished she could warn him. She wished she could tell him not to wait for her at the boulders. She wished she could run into his arms one last time and feel safe. Instead, she lay curled on the floor, tears wetting the blanket until the sun dipped low and the hour of her captivity arrived. Dust Creek's bells rang a slow, mournful toll, and somewhere in town, Caleb McGrath saddled his horse, unaware that the woman he loved was being bound to another man.
Spring crept into Dust Creek tentatively, as though even the seasons feared disturbing the ghosts the winter storms had left behind. The desert flowers bloomed in cautious bursts of color. The air carried a coolness that lingered in the morning and surrendered only grudgingly to the sun at midday. Life had returned to the valley, but for Clara Graves, life had become a prison with polished floors and locked doors. Weeks had passed since the wedding that bound her to Lucas. Weeks since the night he claimed ownership, as though she were land he'd purchased, not a woman with dreams and fears, and a heart that had never been his. The bruises faded, but the memory of them lived beneath her skin. But so did Caleb's memory. Clara held on to that. She held on to him. A letter reached her in secret, a scrap of paper tucked beneath a food delivery basket from a sympathetic kitchen girl. One word written in Caleb's steady hand: spring. Just as they had whispered in the dark between them, before she forced him to leave Dust Creek to save his life. And he had come. He had kept his promise. Clara waited until the household slept, the hour long past midnight, before she stepped from her room and slipped down the back hall, heart pounding so violently she feared even the walls could hear it. She clutched the small pouch of stolen coins she had gathered over the last several weeks, funds hidden away at risk of severe punishment. Each coin was a weapon against Graves' control. Outside, the wind carried the smell of sagebrush and distant rain. Clara lifted her skirts to keep from tripping as she crossed the yard. At the far fence line, a familiar silhouette waited, broad shoulders, heavy frame, the stance of a man ready for violence if it meant protecting the woman he loved. "Caleb," she breathed. He stepped from the shadows, the moonlight cutting across his scarred cheek. He looked thinner, harder, but alive, alive in a way that made Clara's ribs ache with gratitude. "You came," she whispered. "I told you I would." His voice was rough from travel, but steady. "You ready to go?" She nodded, but fear clung to her. Not fear of him, never him, fear of what it meant to run, of what Graves would do when he discovered she was gone, fear of the bloodshed that followed Caleb like a shadow.
Then Caleb reached for her hand, not dragging, not demanding, but offering, a tether, a promise. Clara stepped toward him. A light flared behind them. A voice, cold as the high desert winter. "Going somewhere, wife?" Clara froze. Lucas Graves stood on the porch, a lantern held high, illuminating his pale eyes and the fury burning inside them. The sight was enough to make Clara's breath vanish. Caleb moved instantly, placing his body in front of hers. "Let her go, Graves." "Oh, I don't think so. You think I didn't know you'd come crawling back for her? You think I wouldn't anticipate this little rendezvous?" He lifted his hand. More lanterns flared on the ridge. Shadows resolved into armed men. Caleb swore under his breath. "Clara, get behind!" Gunfire shattered the night. Caleb shoved Clara to the ground as bullets tore through the darkness. He rose with a fluid grace that belied his size, drawing his gun and firing with deadly precision. Two of Graves's men fell before they even hit the dirt. Clara scrambled backward, heart slamming against her ribs. She watched Caleb fight, efficient, controlled, terrifying in his resolve. But there were too many. Shadows moved through the dust, circling him. Graves grabbed Clara by the arm, yanking her upright, pulling her against him like a shield. "You should have accepted your place," he hissed. "Now watch him die because of your selfishness." "No," she choked out, twisting against his hold. Caleb turned at the sound of her voice, and that was all Lucas needed. He pressed the edge of a dagger to her throat, the cold bite of the blade prickling her skin. "Drop your gun," Lucas snarled, "or she dies right here." Caleb stood perfectly still, gun aimed, breath steady, despite the pounding chaos around them. "Caleb," she whispered, voice trembling. "Don't!" But he saw it in his eyes. He would surrender everything, his freedom, his life, if it meant saving her. She couldn't let that happen. Not after everything he'd risked. Not after the night she chose him in the middle of a storm. Not after the love that had grown between them like wildfire. Clara took one breath, then another, and with all the strength she had, she drove her elbow into Lucas Graves's ribs. The blade nicked her skin, just a shallow cut, but she twisted away before Lucas could recover. His grip loosened, his balance wavered. "Caleb!" she cried. Caleb fired. The gunshot cracked the air. Lucas staggered backward, hand clutching his chest. His face contorted in disbelief, then fury, then nothing. He collapsed onto the unforgiving desert ground, dust rising around him like a final shroud. The yard grew still. The remaining men fled into the darkness, their loyalty vanishing with their master's last breath. Caleb rushed to Clara, catching her as her knees buckled. His hands trembled as he touched the cut on her throat. "You're hurt." "I'm fine," she whispered, though tears streaked her cheeks. "You came back." "I never left, not where it mattered." She pressed her forehead to his chest, breathing in the scent of dust and gunpowder and the man who had fought death itself to reach her. Behind them, Tom Dawson stepped from the shadows, horror and relief warring on his face. "Go," he said gruffly. "I'll handle what's left here. Your mother, she would have been proud, Clara." She squeezed his hand once. Then she and Caleb fled into the night, into the mountains, chased by winter storms and the bruises of the past. They were hunted. They were hungry. They nearly froze, but they survived, together. And by spring they found Haven's Rest, a place to lay down their burdens, to build a new name, a new life, a new love that no desert tyrant could touch. Clara Dawson broke her chains that night, and Caleb McGrath, giant, scarred, tender-hearted, caught her in the freedom that followed.